Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump in there. There's a lot of material to cover tonight. I tried to not necessarily wedge 2 lessons into one, but I definitely think there's enough material to call it 2 lessons. But it's continuing our Song of Songs theme of the footsteps of Messiah. A lot of prophecy in here. And if you're new to the class, which I know we had a few new people sign up last week, if you are new to the class, what will happen is I'll hopefully teach. It'll probably run a little bit over an hour tonight because we won't have class tomorrow. And then I will stop the recording. And then if you have questions, feedback, comments, or so forth, we'll do that once the recording stops. In the meantime, I won't be able to see you because I'll have my screen maximized with the PowerPoint. So if you have a procedural question or like you have no idea what I just said, because sometimes we make up our own words, feel free to just type that in the chat. Tashunda's our homeroom mom tonight, but there's lots of other students in here who are kind of used to my weirdities, and they can probably answer your questions if it's something like that. Even if I'm referring to something like, say, a lesson on the 4 kingdoms of the beast, that graphic will come up. If you're like, well, where did you teach that before? They might help you locate that on YouTube. Because I don't think there's anything on here that we haven't at least touched on in the past, but we're going to try to pull some things together tonight. Again, we're looking at very specific prophecies surrounding what Yeshua said, learn from the parable of the fig tree, where he says, learn from the fig tree, the parable. And so we're looking at the circumstances surrounding the footsteps of Messiah. And they're also called the birth pangs or the chevle shel Mashiach. So whether you hear it called the tribulation, the birth pangs of Messiah, the footsteps of Messiah, we're really talking about the same thing. And so because it is so heavily in the prophecy, it may be one of those things you would have to go back and pull something out of the YouTube playlist concerning the relationship between the serpent and the beast, i.e. Egypt and Babylon, what composes the beast, which kingdoms are those, why are they one beast, but nevertheless they're multiple kingdoms and so forth. That's the sort of thing. It takes a long time to lay that groundwork. So if anything does sound crazy or unfamiliar, type that in there, and somebody who's been in the class a while might be able to point you to a YouTube video that'll help you catch up at least to that particular thing. And like I said, be watching your inbox for schedule changes, which we will have over the next 3 weeks until we get back from Jacob's tent. There will be schedule changes. Likely next week, it'll be just the opposite. It's possible we won't have the Monday night class, but we will have the Tuesday class, and I'll just invite you guys to come on in the studio with me if I'm recording. And you can sit in on a couple of sessions while I'm taping The Wicked Lamp, which I think we're working on the seals and the trumpets when I start back. So let me share my screen, quit talking, because I would rather talk about the lesson tonight. So this is lesson 54. And again, the last couple of weeks I've pointed out that we get into a lot of trouble when we try to study prophecy as something that would only be fulfilled one time. Prophecy, whether you're talking about the Torah, the prophets themselves, the writings, even John's revelation, Yeshua's prophecies in the Gospels as he's teaching about end times, no matter which of those you're looking at, you have to realize that these prophecies are like a telescope, because what may have been true of the Exodus from Egypt, there may have also been elements of that same Exodus in the Exodus from Babylon back to Judea to rebuild with the second temple. There may also be a similar application when Israel comes out of the nations where they've been exiled. And this is where Babylon pops back up again. And so as she comes out of those nations to separate from Babylon, again, you're going to see some of the same earmarks of prophecy. So it's not like it was fulfilled once and it will never be again. It keeps cycling. And so in every generation, you have to ask yourself, is this the generation in which he is going to repetitively fulfill a prophecy? And how will I know it? Well, he never duplicates it precisely the same way as he did the previous time, but the earmarks are there. And so that's why we want to think of prophecy in terms of a telescope. How has this circled through time and been fulfilled time after time? And this is where the beauty of understanding the feasts and understanding they come in their cycles, and therefore we would expect things to be fulfilled repetitively. Another word that I like that a guy from our congregation, Timothy Heron, uses is a fractal. That's also an excellent way of looking. It's called a fractal. So if you have more of a mathematical mindset, that might make more sense to you. To me, I'm a little simpler. I just like to see it as a telescope. You might be seeing something from far away. You might be seeing it from close up. It just depends. Again, you're looking at the same thing. It's just the perspective of the time that you're living in. So we want to look, just for review, back at some passages from the Song of Songs that we're still working with. We have to keep circling back to them so we don't lose our context. So we're going back to the song, chapter 2, verses 10 through 11, where my beloved responded and said to me, "Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along. For behold, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone." Even up to this point, we've had multiple explanations of what that passage means. And we can circle back really to the essence of it is resurrection. It's describing a resurrection of some kind. It might be describing the exodus from Egypt. Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, come along, come on, come out of Egypt. The winter of your exile is past. The rain is over and gone. Then we saw how they also applied it to the exiles returning from Babylon. We also saw how it applied to Joshua and Eleazar leading Israel over the Jordan and into the land, into their inheritance. And that's what I mean by telescoping or fractals, that you'll see these elements repetitively. So I want to revisit something from a previous lesson that we used, again, as an explanation for these particular verses. And this is from the Midrash, section 22. And let me get this where I can even see it. The quote we had at that time is, "What did he say to me?" What was said at the time that Israel was told to arise. And let me go back here. And I want to point out, I should have put it in bold so you would remember that lesson, but where it says, my beloved responded and said, there's a duplication there. It's repetitive. It's not really necessary to convey the simple meaning. And therefore, because two words are used, we have to ask why. Why did he use two words when he could have used one? My beloved said to me. Why does it have the two there? And that's, if you'll remember, we did have that lesson on that. And then one of the answers was, what did he say to me? This month shall be for you the beginning of the months. It shall be for you the first of the months of the year. And of course, that's from the Exodus. This is what Moses was supposed to tell the people as they're preparing for Passover, that they will begin to count their months from this particular new moon. And the implication here is so many people have questions about the calendar. They're concerned about the calendar because so many Torah keepers are on different calendars. I don't think they need to be, but at this point they are. How will that be resolved? I think it's highly probable, not just possible, but highly probable there will be some event, some particular thing that occurs that people of faith would recognize, because a specific message was given to Israel when to recalibrate their calendars. And the rabbis in the Midrash acknowledge that because of so many interruptions to the calendar, that it can't possibly be exact. And one thing they're depending upon is that at the time of Messiah, when we begin to hear the footsteps of Messiah, there will be a particular event in which Messiah will ensure that our months are recalibrated. So in essence, we're all on the same time clock. So we won't have everybody doing what's right in their own eyes. Instead, we would have the opportunity to recalibrate. And there's even some missing years in there that are missing on purpose. And they're missing for a reason. And probably, unless you're familiar with the Jewish literature, you don't even know about those missing years and why they were not calculated in. And I think ultimately it goes back to so much of the persecution and so forth that went on in the medieval period. So many things were burned during the Inquisition. And so much was hidden. Some things were purposely obscured so that only if this information had been transmitted to you from your teacher would you understand the context of it. And so, with the internet age, a lot of that information is out there now. At any rate, what the rabbis are saying is that at the time of Messiah, all calendars are going to have to be recalibrated just because of the troubles and the tribulations of history. But in essence, it's saying the bride is going to be awakened from her spiritual slumber because she will need to depart Egypt. And when we say she needs to depart Egypt, that's when we apply our telescope. She's going to need to depart from Babylon, and not just Babylon of ancient history. That Babylon appears again in the book of Revelation. And so she will once again need to be awakened from her spiritual slumber in order to depart Babylon in every nation. Babylon will exist in every nation. And so, again, with this telescope application or the fractal, we're going to have to slide the lens a little bit from the return of Israel from Egyptian exile to the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we're going to fast forward to the time of the Babylonian exile. And we're going to apply the same prophecy, arise, my love. And so at this point, the northern tribes have been scattered. The Jews still have an identity in Babylon, although it's understood that there were remnants of every tribe among them. And it's during this period that they all came to be called Jewish. And so sometimes defining the terms can be a challenge, but just understand that from the time of the Babylonian exile, really it's the tribe of Judah who took that leadership. But what became of those 10 northern tribes, scripture actually tells us where they went, but then where they went from there, we don't know. The understanding among Jews is actually out there among all they are in exile all over the earth. But now the telescope takes us to the time of Daniel and Ezra, where the beast kingdom of Babylon has been overthrown. Remember, it's overthrown by the Medes, overthrown by the Persians. Now you have these successive kingdoms that are pretty much right there in the same area. But during the times of Daniel and Ezra, they're saying, now, once again, we are being spoken to. The Jews in the Babylonian exile were being spoken to. And so they say, my beloved also spoke through Daniel and responded through Ezra. What did he say to me? Arise, my love, my fair one, and go forth for yourself. The winter refers, in this case, to the 70 years of exile. And Daniel, they're mentioning Daniel specifically as one of these voices that is speaking to the Jews. And therefore his voice would speak to Israel in any generation where the exile is about to be ended and the exiles are about to be returned to the land of promise. And so this is where people make a huge mistake. They read the book of Daniel and they work 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 and they work, trying to calculate things out and come out with a date that is in their generation. Happens time after time. And they're wrong time after time. When they predict a certain date of Messiah's return, and then it passes, and then they just recalculating. But here's the problem. Daniel may have been speaking to his generation, but he was also speaking to future generations at the exact same time. So it's going to be difficult to lock in and say, well, he's just calculating the 70 years of the Babylonian exile. When that's supposed to end and that second temple would be built, the first temple rebuilt on its foundations, called the second temple. But according to this telescoping idea, Daniel can also be speaking to the exiles among the nations who are prepared to return and build a third temple under King Messiah. And so here's what Daniel in chapter 9, verse 2 says. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So they say Daniel at this point becomes one of the speakers to Israel, i.e. Judah, saying, arise, my love. And then, of course, we've got lots of historical information in the prophet Ezra, in his book. And people tend to look at Daniel's prophecy more than Ezra's, but I would say probably if you want to get the full picture of what Daniel is speaking, then you have to put Ezra back in that context. And even Nehemiah, as we're looking at Nehemiah, we see a very specific reference to what, people get all concerned about the mark of the beast. I'm like, look, if you're following Torah, the odds of you having the mark of the beast are pretty slim unless you're just a full-fledged poser. Because Nehemiah tells you the context, and it has to do with commercial activity on Shabbat. You have to put things back into their context. So here's where the rabbis are pointing to Jeremiah 29, because Daniel is referring to it in his calculation. And if Daniel is one of these who is speaking to the generations, arise, my love, and his reference point that he literally says in his text is Jeremiah 29. It's a long passage. It's actually longer than this, but I want you to see how important this is. If Daniel mentions it, then of course we go back to the original source he's quoting from. So it says, these are the words of the letter which Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the rest of the elders of the exile. This is going out to a generation in exile now in Babylon. The priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after King Jeconiah and the queen mother, the high officials, the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the craftsmen. Kind of file that away for our next lesson, the craftsmen, because in the next lesson, I want to talk about the 4 craftsmen of the tribulation. The craftsmen and the metalworkers had departed from Jerusalem. The letter was sent by the hand of Elisah, the son of Shaphan, and Gemariah, the son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to Babylon to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, saying, and I put that in there because I want you to have a GPS that's pointing to Babylon. Here's what's important. This is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Now, because you know that Babylon is now among the nations, go ahead and insert yourself as one of the exiles to whom this message is being sent. You are in Babylon, if you are not literally living in Jerusalem right now, you are probably in a Babylon nation. He says, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and father sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may give birth to sons and daughters, and grow in numbers there, and do not decrease. Seek the prosperity of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord in its behalf, for in its prosperity will be your prosperity. So this is the message that Jeremiah sent to the Jews in Babylon and among the provinces of Babylon. He says, carry on, increase, go about your daily lives, seek the prosperity of the nation where you live. But there will be a designated time, and this is why Daniel kind of inserts in here his calculation of 70 years. There will come an end point when, for his generation, the 70 years would have been completed. And once that 70 years that was decreed was completed, then it was their job to go back, not to hang out in Babylon. For this is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says, do not let your prophets who are in your midst or your diviners deceive you, and do not listen to their interpretations of your dreams, which you dream. For they prophesy falsely to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. For this is what the Lord says. See, what are the prophets and the diviners saying? They're saying, stay right here. We're comfortable right here. We're making a good living here. We have security here. We have all the comforts of Babylon here. He says, when these 70 years, when the time period is complete, at that designated time, that's the time to stop seeing yourself as a perpetual citizen of Babylon and start looking home toward Jerusalem, the direction where Daniel prayed every day, 3 times a day. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you to bring you back to this place. Okay, like I said, fill yourself in that blank. You don't know the exact time. You might think you do, but you don't know the exact time when the final Babylonian exile will end. But there will come a designated time. And he's going to describe this time to us without telling us the exact date. But you will know the time. For Israel, they knew the time. They knew there was 70 years because they had prophets like Daniel. But they also had false prophets who said, just settle down and have a good time where you are. He says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for prosperity and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope. Well, why would they have to worry about disaster if they were living in Babylon? Well, again, if they've hunkered down and said, hey, this place is great, we don't need to go back to Jerusalem. He can bless us no matter where we are. Well, yes, he can. And he said, seek the prosperity of this kingdom where you are. But a day will come when you have to turn that energy back toward Jerusalem. And if you don't, he says, you might be forfeiting the prosperity that I have planned for you, because you settled down and you loved the prosperity where you were in Babylon. You cease to look homeward. And the problem with that is Babylon is designated for disaster and destruction. Babylon will be cut off without a future and a hope. I mean, that's John's message. In history, we know that Daniel lasted through what, 3 kingdoms? I want to say 3, maybe 4, but I know that he lasted through the Babylonians. And then the Babylonians were just defeated. And then you've got the Medes, and then you've got the Persians. And so he outlasted even kings, even King Nebuchadnezzar. He says, then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you, and you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. I will let myself be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations. You see the shift here? We think we're talking about Daniel and 70 years in Babylon. But expand that. Babylon had 127 provinces in its day. And now the shift here, it helps us see the Babylon that John is describing that sits upon many waters. She stretches around the world. And he says, I'm going to gather you from all the nations and all the places where I've driven you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from where I sent you into exile. You see the problem here. If you don't understand you're in exile, you will never turn home. You will never feel the need to seek him and find him as it regards your inheritance in Jerusalem. And so you can see why when the early believers disconnected from what they thought were Jewish feasts, they actually disconnected from the feasts of Adonai. And when you disengage from those feasts, you disengage from Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is the focal point of those feasts. That's where your eyes turn. Even if you're not in Jerusalem, every year you say, next year in Jerusalem. Next year in Jerusalem. If you can't be there, the feast instill in you a longing for Jerusalem so that you will not be subject to the plans for disaster that he has for Babylon. His plan for Babylon is for it not to have a future and it to have no hope. He wants you to have a future and hope and prosperity in the land of your inheritance with the heart of Jerusalem. And he says, when you seek me, that's how you're going to come to understand your true citizenship. You are going to understand you are a citizen of Jerusalem. And until you understand that fact, you will continue to be content in Babylon, which is designated for destruction. And the place of your safety, the place of your redemption is in Jerusalem. He wants to bring you out of those nations when that designated time comes and bring you into the holy city. And he goes on, he says, because you have said, the Lord has raised up prophets for us in Babylon. In other words, you're happy with your spiritual life wherever you are. You have no driving compulsion to get back to Jerusalem. If it is, maybe it's something vague, like, well, maybe when Messiah comes, this cloud will suck me up in the air and it'll transport me to Jerusalem and drop me right down like, pillows of clouds with chocolate. And no, that's not the way it works. If you settle down in the nation of your exile and say, this is plenty, and you listen to these silly prophets, he says, that's going to be a problem. If this is what you have said, the Lord has raised up prophets for us in Babylon. For this is what the Lord says concerning the king who sits on the throne of David, and concerning all the people who live in this city, your brothers who did not go with you into exile. This is what the Lord of armies says. Behold, I am sending upon them the sword, the famine, and plague, and I will make them like rotten figs that cannot be eaten due to rottenness. You see how he circles us back to the time of figs in Egypt? The time that he separates out the unripe figs and apparently also the rotten ones. And remember, the fig tree is Israel. So there will be those among Israel who are rotten, absolutely rotten. And if they want to retain their Babylonian identity, if they want to retain their Egyptian identity, then it's entirely possible that they will turn rotten. He says, I will pursue them with the sword, with famine, and with plague, and I will make them an object of terror to all the kingdoms in the earth, to be a curse and an object of horror and hissing, and a disgrace among all the nations where I have driven them, because they have not listened to my words, declares the Lord, which I sent to them again and again by my servants, the prophets, but you did not listen, declares the Lord. You see, as you work through the prophets, how many times the prophets point the people back to Jerusalem and the spiritual cleansing that needs to take place in them so that they can be regathered. He says, you therefore hear the word of the Lord, all you exiles, whom I have sent away from Jerusalem to Babylon. Right? So just stretch that telescope out and insert yourself in there as the exile. And Jeremiah is saying, hear the word of the Lord, you exile. I have sent you away from Jerusalem to Babylon. Don't get happy where you are. Don't lean upon the systems of Babylon, or you could become a rotten fig. So you can even see that there's a repetition there when he talks about the altered judgments, which the altered judgments are the sword, the famine, the plague, and the wild beast. He says those twice. Behold, I'm sending upon them the sword, the famine, and the plague. And then he repeats it. I will pursue them with the sword, the famine, and the plague. When there's repetition, you pay attention. And then we understand, oh, he's talking to two Babylons here. He's talking to Babylon at the time of Daniel, but he's talking also to a future Babylon. And that makes perfect sense when Babylon pops up in the book of Revelation. And like we've been studying, how the unripe figs fall out of the darkness of the sky. And of course, the sages are saying these are the unrepentant people who are Israel. It's not really even talking about the nations at this point. Now, at this point, we know the nations are designated for disaster and destruction. This is why he's trying to pull them out and to remind them what their citizenship is. He says, don't stay in Babylon and become a rotten fig, because these nations are going to destruction. Let me gather you. All right, so if you're not familiar with the 4 altar judgments, I've given you 3 references here where you can do a little more investigation. We talk about it quite a bit in workbook 2, the 7 abominations of the wicked land. But you can reference Ezekiel 5:17, Ezekiel 14:21, Revelation 6:8. but it's basically those four. And when you see those four horses being released in the book of Revelation, each of those is going to bring one of these altar judgments with him as he goes. So it's going to be the sword, the famine, the plague, and wild beasts. And there's a lot of overlap there. And you've seen this graphic before. And he's saying, this is what I have planned for Babylon. And if you know where your citizenship is, then these things will be a trouble to you. But they don't have to be your destruction. Right? If you will make this choice in terms of your citizenship, if you will become a citizen of the kingdom of heaven and understand that the capital of your citizenship is in Jerusalem, because your responsibility is to keep the feasts in Jerusalem. If you're keeping those feasts, then you won't ever forget. You can't lose that identity unless you just consciously.
Alyssa, I'm sorry. I muted you. Can you hear me? Did you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I'm sorry. I was looking for someone else.
Okay. Yeah, we do have a lot of noise tonight for some reason. It's typically a cell phone in my experience. I've even had my own cell phone come off when I was trying to use that on Zoom. So you have to kind of just keep your fingers away from it, which is not easy to do when you've got notifications popping up. At any rate, he's reminding us here through the rotten figs that the rotten figs are going to be destroyed through these altar judgments as they are sent out, as these four horsemen are sent out among the nations to destroy Babylon among the nations. If you're a rotten fig, if you're an unripe fig, then you might miss that call home to Jerusalem because you're not even expecting it. You have disengaged from Jerusalem. To you, it's an idea. It's not like, you really want me to go to Jerusalem for the feast? Well, yeah, he really does. It may not be possible in your exile, but there should be a longing in your heart to go there. And if it's at all within your power, you should make your way there. Like Joshua and Caleb, they knew they were going to go back for another 40 years, almost 40 years. They went anyway. They gave a good report anyway. And so Jerusalem is not for you to go in and look around and say, well, I don't feel anything here, and go back and give a bad report. No. When you go to Jerusalem, it's so that you allow yourself to see what cannot be seen with the natural eye. When you do what he says, you'll seek me and you'll find me when you search for me with all your heart. For those who can't afford to literally go to Jerusalem, it's something that they have to consciously choose to remind themselves that they are citizens of a place they've never physically set foot in. But he's saying you need to remember Jerusalem. If I forget Jerusalem, may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. In other words, I don't deserve to speak a word ever again if I forget Jerusalem. May my right hand lose its skill. Whatever your strong hand is, you say, it would be as if I had no strong hand because I don't deserve one. If I forget my citizenship in Jerusalem, this is what is going to sustain me through the footsteps of Messiah so that I don't miss the call home. Because if you're not expecting something, then it's perfectly logical that you would miss it. If you don't expect to see something, if you don't expect to hear something, it might be there and you wouldn't even recognize it just because you're not expecting it. So again, verse 13, the fig tree has ripened its fruit and the vines in blossom have given forth their fragrance. arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along. And we looked at that last week as a chiasm, as the bookends of a chiasm. And then we're backing up one. The blossoms have already appeared in the land. The time has arrived for pruning the vines, and the voice of the turtle dove has been heard in our land. Now, next week, we're going to look at the voice of the turtle dove as the voice of King Messiah. But I wanted you to just review again, the blossoms have already appeared in the land, and the time has come for pruning the vines. So we've got the pruning the vines. We see the vines are in blossom. The fig tree has ripened its fruit. Okay, that's our context. So now, as we're looking at the prophecy telescope, it's going to slide from the blossoms who appeared in the land to proclaim, arise, my love, as Moses and Aaron in their time in Egypt, Joshua and Eleazar leading the Israelites over the Jordan. Now it's taking in Ezra and Mordecai. So we have a growing list of blossoms who have appeared at different points in history to speak that word to Israel, arise, my love. You know, it's like Moses, this is the beginning of the months for you. He always sends blossoms to help Israel arouse herself. And they're always urging this return to Jerusalem. For Mordecai and Ezra, they were returning to Jerusalem to build the second temple after Babylon destroyed it. But before that could happen, those 70 weeks that Daniel calculated, those had to be, there were actually 70 years of exile. Those had to be completed. But also what had to be completed was Nebuchadnezzar had to be destroyed. Remember what we said about don't get comfortable in Babylon? Because it's designated for destruction. So in the interim here, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, is destroyed. He's pruned away. Remember, it's the time of pruning the vines. He's pruned away. We have the kingdoms of the Medes, the kingdoms of the Persians. We have this continual trimming. And this is like a message to the Jews, do not get comfortable. You know, had the Jews at the time of Mordecai and Esther already gone home, because they could have gone home, there wouldn't even be a scroll of Esther had they just all gone home to Jerusalem when they could have. Which it was kind of a progressive process as you look at the history of like Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel. But this is something to look at, is that Mordecai, even though he was promoted under the reign of Ahasuerus, he eventually returned to Jerusalem, because we're always wondering, like, if he was such a righteous man, what was he still doing, you know, in Persia? And again, everything has a plan, but according to Ezra 2 verses 1 and 2, it looks like he eventually did return with Zerubbabel, because it says, now these are the people of the province who came up out of the captivity of the exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had taken in exile to Babylon. And they returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his city. These came with Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Realiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, and Baanah. So there's Mordecai. And they're saying he was one of those blossoms that, because of Mordecai's actions with Queen Esther, that many Jews were aroused, and they realized their precarious position among the Persians. Again, like he says, if these kingdoms are designated for destruction eventually, don't think that you found the safe place, that you have found your new citizenship. And so apparently under Mordecai, he influenced many Jews to return with Zerubbabel. And this pruning that it's talking about, it's not just the pruning away of the king of Babylon. It's also thought to refer to both Jews and non-Jews who did return to Jerusalem. Remember, there's several waves of Jews returning to Jerusalem during this time period after Babylon's destroyed. And what happened is in the exile, many Jews were not circumcised, just like they weren't circumcised that 40 years in the wilderness. And so when they returned, there was the questions as, are you really Jewish? Are you truly an Israelite? Plus, under Mordecai, apparently there were many converts to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And of course, they had not been circumcised. And so as they're coming back to the land, coming back to Jerusalem, apparently there was another wave of circumcision. Esther 8:17 kind of reminds us of how this wave of conversion occurred. It says, in each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was joy and jubilation for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews because the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. And so it is supposed that among these cities and provinces where there were converts, that many of them also, when the way was open to go back and rebuild the temple, they also made their way to the promised land and underwent circumcision at that point. And that was the problem, like it says, both with Jews and the converts, because circumcision to a large extent had not been done in Babylon. And so in Ezra 2:59, it even goes so far as to name people who were not able to provide evidence of their father's household and their descendants, whether they were of Israel. And so apparently if they lacked a sign of circumcision and they lacked, any sort of pedigree in hand, then they were expected not just to live according to the Torah, but for the males to also be circumcised at that time. So the pruning that it talks about in the song is seen as a euphemism for circumcision, but it's also seen as a prophecy of a time to come, that when Messiah returns to rebuild the third temple, the sages say that what happened before in Persia will happen again. What happened in Egypt before will happen again. Remember the mixed multitude that came out with them? They say that's going to happen again. And they say that many non-Jews will convert and be circumcised at that time. And they're basing this on Zechariah chapter 2, verses 7 through 12. It says, "You, Zion, escape, you who are living with the daughter of Babylon." You who are living with the daughter of Babylon. Again, it's referring to descendants from the time of Babylon. And remember, as you're looking at the beast kingdoms, they're all one kingdom, whether you start at the head with Babylon or whether you end up down at the clay and the iron feet of Rome's daughters. You're still talking about daughters of Babylon. For the Lord of armies says this, "After glory, he has sent me against the nations that plunder you. For the one who touches you touches the apple of his eye. For behold, I am going to wave my hand over them so that they will be plunder for their slaves." That's what happened in Egypt. "Then you will know that the Lord of armies has sent me. Shout for joy and rejoice, daughter of Zion, for behold, I am coming and I will dwell in your midst, declares the Lord. And many nations will join themselves to the Lord on that day and will become my people. Then I will dwell in your midst, and you will know that the Lord of armies has sent me to you. And the Lord will possess Judah as his portion in the Holy Land and will again choose Jerusalem." So based on this prophecy, the sages are saying that there will be a remnant as well among non-Jews who will join themselves to the covenant, and they will go to Jerusalem. That will be their identity. So another telescope explanation is that this time of Israel's circumcision, or refinding their identity, refinding their citizenship. Oh, that's right. We're not Babylonians. We're Israelites. We're Jerusalemites. They also see this as a time of pruning for Rome to be terminated. So where Israel will experience a circumcision, and they're not precise on whether they're talking about a physical circumcision or like Ezekiel's circumcision of the heart, Jeremiah's circumcision of the heart. They don't specify that. They just allude to a circumcision will occur at this time, just like it did at the Passover, just as it did when they returned from the Babylonian exile. But they say at the same time, there will be circumcision for Israel. There will be excision for Rome. Rome will be terminated. And you're saying, weren't they terminated a long time ago? No, they weren't. They're still around. Those systems, the daughters of Rome are still around in the mingled iron and clay feet. And ultimately, they're all daughters of Babylon. It's the last, Rome is the last beast kingdom connected to the head of Babylon, the golden head of Babylon. And so if we take what Jeremiah said in chapter 29, specifically verses 5-7, as he's speaking to the exiles of Israel, now we have some context. Remember, he says, build houses, live in them, plant gardens, eat their produce, take wives, fathers, sons, and daughters, take wives for take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands so that they may give birth to sons and daughters, and grow in numbers there, and do not decrease. Seek the prosperity of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord in its behalf, for in its prosperity will be your prosperity. Right? So if Israel has not lost her identity as Israel, then she will actually become a people within a people. Let's go back to Esther, chapter 3, verse 8. Then Haman, may his name be blotted out, said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they don't comply with the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. So what's being said here is that these Jews who were scattered among the 127 provinces of the kingdom, they have their own set of rules. And their own set of rules is the Torah. And it's not that they didn't comply with the king's laws at all, but apparently they so identified with the Torah that anybody looking at them could tell they still retained their identity as Jews. They still retained their identity as covenant keepers more than they identified with Persia or with any of its provinces. They retained, it was so distinct that you could point and people would understand what you were saying. It's their Torah that sets them apart. And remember, there was 127 provinces in Persia. Sarah, who was prophesied to be the mother of many nations, lived to be 127 years old. What does it say? That the descendants of Sarah are represented by the 127 provinces of Persia. That there would be Israelites, there would be Jews, there would be believers in every known province of the kingdom. In our case, in our generation, in every nation in the world. You're liable to find a descendant of Sarah. And among those nations, you might find that they are also keeping the Torah. That has become their citizenship and their identity above that of the nation where they live, to the extent that people can look at them and tell. Which takes us back to last week. Remember, this is Haman or Haman talking to the king. Last week, we saw how if you take the vowels out of Genesis, was it Genesis 3, it becomes Haman the tree. And so in this proto-prophecy, Haman, the tree, existed in the garden and tried to set up shop with the serpent in a rebellion. He wanted a kingdom of his own, but he didn't want to go out and make his own kingdom. He wanted to take the holy ones. And this is what it said in Isaiah to the king of Babylon. You have said in your heart, I will lift my throne above the throne of God. I will sit on the mount of the Moed. I'll take control of Jerusalem. I'll squash their Passovers and their Shavuots and their Sukkots, and I will replace them with holidays of my own. And so when King Ahasuerus, when he goes out into the garden because he's so angry, and then he comes back in, and Haman has thrown himself at Queen Esther on the bed, basically, the couch. They still do that. Their beds, their couch too. It looks as though he's trying to molest the queen. And of course, he's put to death. He's hung on his own tree. But it looks to the king as though Haman, may his name be blotted out, wants the queen for himself. And see, that's how Esther set the king up. When she invites him and Haman to the banquet, she says, may the king and Haman come to a banquet I have prepared for him, singular. So the king's up all night, can't sleep. Why can't he sleep? He doesn't know who him is. Is she inviting him, her husband? Or is she inviting Haman? Is the banquet for him? How does she know Haman? Who is Haman to her? And so at the worst possible moment, while King Ahasuerus is contemplating who him is, Haman walks in wanting to kill Mordecai early. And the king says, what would you do for someone the king would like to honor? And Haman lists all the things he would like to have because he thinks the king's talking about him. The king hears it, he processes and says, oh, Haman wants my kingdom. He wants my clothes. He wants my horse. He wants my kingdom. All this is already working. So if you put that back in the garden, you can see the proto-prophecy of that being played out in the scroll of Esther. And so the Midrash goes on to describe the destruction of Rome. Remember, he's saying, don't identify with Babylon because it's designated for destruction. It's going to be conquered by the Medes, by the Persians, by the Greeks, by the Romans eventually. Each one built on top of the other. But this pruning, this time of pruning, they said to this last generation that hears the footsteps of Messiah, what they should hear at this time of pruning, is at the same time they will receive a circumcision. At the same time, Rome will be excised. It'll be destroyed. They say the time has come for the wicked kingdom, that is Rome, to be terminated. The time has come for the kingdom of heaven to be revealed to the entire world. As it is stated, Hashem will be king over all the land on that day. Hashem will be one, and his name will be one. Rome is going to be the last kingdom of the beast that is destroyed. Now, the iron legs of the historical Rome today are mingled with the clay of its daughters. like I say, you can get back in the YouTube videos and get a little bit more information about who those daughters of Rome might be. But in short, they are systems that are derived from that Roman kingdom, which is also Edom in prophecy. So in Jeremiah's instructions to the Jews in Babylon, that they were supposed to live peaceably in exile, the prophecy is there will come a time when you can no longer do that. I'm telling you to do that now, he said, but there will come a time when the designated time arrives, you will no longer be able to do that, because your covenant identity is going to be what makes you targeted. There's going to be lots of Haman the trees out there, and they're going to identify you by the fact that you place your Israelite citizenship. Even if you don't live there, you place your Israelite citizenship above any other national citizenship. You place Adonai's laws above any other laws of the land. And so even though you're living side by side with the provincial people groups, just like they did in Babylon, if you assimilate into Babylon, you're going to be lost. Doesn't mean you're not saved. It means you're going to be a rotten fig. It might mean second resurrection, because he doesn't want you to be destroyed with Babylon. He doesn't want you to be destroyed with Rome and her daughters. It's your observance of the Torah that's going to distinguish you as a true Jew, as a true Israelite in Babylon. And this is how the serpent even knows to pursue the woman in the wilderness. She's doing something, her children are doing something that sets them apart. And so part of her wilderness experience is a withdrawal from the king's system of government at any point in which it conflicts with divine law. If divine law says don't bow to an idol, and King Nebuchadnezzar says bow to my idol, you're going to draw attention to yourself because you'll be the only one standing. So she might be in the wilderness, even if she's still physically living among those 127 provinces of Babylon, of Persia. She's Sarah's child. And they recognize, like Esther's identity was hidden, but they know who the true queen is. They know she's a leader of righteousness. They know the difference between Sarah above and Hagar below. And they know their true king is not King Ahasuerus. So at the time of this pruning, this arise, my love, we can see how Jeremiah is prophesying, Esther's prophesying, Yeshua is going to teach it. We'll take a look at what he said. This wilderness nation, it doesn't seem to be in a physically separate place. Physically, it's still living among the daughters of the final beast kingdom of Rome or Edom. And if we look at this week's Torah portion by Yishlach, if you compare all the information we have about Esau, whose name is Edom, he's the red one, he's the scarlet beast. We get more information about Esau and Edom and his descendant Amalek, who is the ancestor of wicked Haman, may his name be blotted out. You're getting all the Edomite information in this week's Torah portion. It is congruent. And so if you want to understand this pruning away of Rome that is being prophesied, you can look at this week's Torah portion and find some prophetic clues, because you're getting way more data points about Esau and Vayishlach than probably any other Torah portion. So what happens in this Torah portion after the meeting with Jacob and Esau, Esau departs. And who remains in the land? Israel. Jacob becomes Israel, and he remains with his family and his flocks, and he builds Sukkot. It's Esau who has to depart. It's not his citizenship. So, same Torah portion. As we look at this pattern of the separation between Israel and Edom or Rome, you see Jacob wrestling with a man, with an angel, and he wrestles all night long until it's almost time for the sun to rise, and this angel says, I've got to go. He's strong all through the night, and he endures until sunrise, and then he has to go. And we know sunrise can symbolize resurrection. And Jewish tradition will tell us that this was Esau's angel that Jacob struggled with all night until he became Israel, until he found his citizenship. Instead of Yaakov, one who follows after, he's going to become a leader. He's going to become a prince of El, Yisrael. His children are going to inherit the land. And eventually his children are going to inherit the original land, the Garden of Eden. But if you notice, just prior to this struggle with Esau's angel, if that's indeed who it is, Jacob divides his family into separate flocks for preservation, hoping that a remnant could remain if the worst happened. What did we say last week about the flight to the wilderness? That people of righteousness will be so vexed by their generation that they'll begin to seek out one another and form flocks in the wilderness. This is exactly what happens in our Torah portion. So next week, we're going to learn about the plague that the rabbis prophesied would sweep around the whole world just prior to the days of Messiah. It's pretty incredible. It'll blow your mind. You're like, oh my goodness, we have one of those. We have a plague that swept around the whole world. And they say this particular event occurs just prior to the days of Messiah, that this is part of the footsteps. But I want to wrap up this lesson first before we go on to that one, because I want us to get a mindset, like, where is this wilderness? At least for an initial stage of gathering, you were still out there in Babylon. And so in the Song of Songs, it's using the vines in blossom, the vineyard Israel, the fig tree Israel. They're giving forth their fragrance as a sign it's time to arise and come away. Why are so many coming to the Torah in this generation? I suspect it's the vine and blossom. It's giving forth a fragrance. It's giving forth a sign that we're learning from the fig tree, that it's almost time to arise and come away. At any rate, following this worldwide plague they're talking about, at the time of the fig tree, the sages write, these vines in blossom allude to the righteous survivors of the plague. And regarding them, the verse states, and the survivor will be in Zion, and the remaining one in Jerusalem, holy will be said of him. And they're quoting from Isaiah 4:3 there. So they're saying, out of this worldwide plague, there will be righteous survivors. But this does not mean that everybody who's harvested out of the earth during this plague or during the tribulation of the footsteps are wicked. Remember, I think it was last week, we talked about how there's going to be many righteous who will also be harvested out of Israel to test them and to see if she'll be discouraged or if she will find her true identity, quit being followers, and start being princes and princesses of El. It's the removal of so many righteous people is to drive her to this decision of faith that I will follow him in this wilderness. Or they will be so discouraged, they'll just go back to what they know, just like the Israelites wanted to go back to Egypt. He says, you're going to follow me, or you're going to lean on the beast. Are you going to lean on Babylon? Are you going to lean on Rome? Because this side-by-side living in Babylon, what he's saying, there's going to come a point of no return. And so the ripe figs of Israel, they're going to start emitting a fragrance, even in these days of darkness. Remember, we said this was the pruning, the unrepentant Israelites. Some of them were pruned out during the 9th plague, the 3 days and the 3 nights of darkness. Kind of goes back to that verse about you couldn't see your brother. Okay. Understand that's like a pretest. The ripe figs had light in all their dwellings. The rotten figs, the unripe figs, it sounds like they were subject to the same darkness. Here's what Isaiah 57 says. The righteous person perishes and no one takes it to heart, and devout people are taken away while no one understands. For the righteous person is taken away from evil. He enters into peace. They rest in their beds, each one who walked in his upright way. Right? So just because somebody was taken out in the plague does not mean they were a rotten fig. It could mean. But if the person was righteous, if you know them by their deeds, then understand, he said, you need to understand this. When a devout person is taken away, he's being delivered from evil and entering into peace. On the other hand, the rotten figs, the unripe figs, they are experiencing and tasting destruction the same as Babylon and Rome. He says, come here, you sons of a sorceress, offspring of an adulterer and a prostitute. Of whom do you make fun? Against whom do you open wide your mouth and stick out your tongue? Are you not children of rebellion, offspring of deceit? And so when we see these verses in contrast to one another, you say, okay, we've got this worldwide plague, a bunch of people are going to die. Okay, I can rest assured that if I have seen a righteous person taken out of my life, I have no reason to be discouraged because he's been taken away from evil and entered into peace. But if I see somebody who is a child of rebellion, then this is the harvest. This is the harvest of the rebels. And I'm going to give you a couple of contexts for this. In Revelation 2:20, this is the message to the assembly of Thyatira. It says, I have this against you, that you tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and she teaches and leads my bondservants astray so that they commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. I gave her time to repent. Remember the context of the 3 days and 3 nights of darkness. They say the Israelites who were harvested out at that time, they were unrepentant, that they would have obstructed the Exodus. He says, I gave her time to repent, and she does not want to repent of her sexual immorality. Behold, I will throw her on a bed of sickness, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation unless they repent of her deeds, and I will kill her children with plague. And all the churches will know that I am he who searches the minds and hearts, and I will give to each one of you according to your deeds. So this appears to match what Isaiah is prophesying about the children of a prostitute, of an adulterer, of a sorceress, children of rebellion. And then Revelation 17:1, then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So it's just as the prophecy said, the exiles of Israel will be scattered out into Babylon, Rome, and she will be mingled among peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. If she engages in immorality with those nations of the earth, if that is her identity, then she will be part of Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And this is what her offspring will be like. On the other hand, if we are descendants of Sarah, she, remember, was promised to be a mother of many nations. Righteousness. So Sarah above, Jerusalem above, the mother of many nations. Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots in many nations. So now, let's look at what Yeshua taught us in Matthew 24 concerning his footsteps and the separation of the virtuous woman Israel from the children of the harlot who have become citizens of Babylon instead of Jerusalem. And remember the setup from last week. Yeshua says, from the fig tree, learn the parable. When you see its branches and leaves sprouting, know that he is near to the gates. And remember, the gates is where it said King Messiah will wage war with Gog. And he'll bring his holy ones with him, and he will set up his kingdom at that time. So I'm reading again from the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, the English translation of it. And it's Matthew 24, 32 through 41. He says, as in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. Just as before the flood, they were eating, drinking, being fruitful, and multiplying until the day when Noah entered the ark. They did not know until the flood came upon them and destroyed them. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then if there be two plowing in a field, one righteous and the other evil, the one will be taken and the other left. Two women will be grinding at a mill. One will be taken and the other left. This is because the angels at the end of the world will remove the stumbling blocks from the world and will separate the good from the evil. All right, now there's no connection there unless you do kind of know what the tradition was about the plague of darkness, that 3 days and 3 nights of darkness, where it says the Hebrews had light in all their dwellings. It also makes an odd reference that it was so dark that you couldn't see your brother. And the brother, the rabbis say, were the unripe figs. These were the unrepentant Israelites. And so that the Egyptians could not see this harvest of the rotten figs, of the unripe figs, it was conducted in the darkness. The Hebrews really couldn't see it because they had light. They were having a different experience. But in the darkness, their brothers were harvested out so that they would not become stumbling blocks for the Exodus. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. But what I really wanted to point out, again, was what Jeremiah instructed the Israelites in Babylon. And like I say, apply the telescope. Stick yourself in there as the exile in Babylon. And see how close these instructions are to what Yeshua just prophesied. Just as before the flood, they're eating, drinking, being fruitful, multiplying until the day when Noah entered the ark. That's what Jeremiah says. Build houses, live in them, plant gardens, eat their produce, take wives and father sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands so that they may give birth to sons and daughters and grow in numbers there and do not decrease. See, when you compare that. So just as in the days of Noah, what you understand about those days of Noah, about how the wickedness had increased, how a flood represents a flood of wickedness, that a flood of wickedness would sweep over the earth. Therefore, the destruction would also be in a flood of water. But until that time, they were being fruitful and multiplying until that day. What does Jeremiah say? Do the same thing. Be fruitful and multiply until the designated time. Seek the prosperity of the places where you have been sent into exile and pray on its behalf. But when the time comes, if you don't know your citizenship, the danger is that you would have so compromised with the harlot that you would have forgotten your covenant, that you would be undistinguishable from a Babylonian. You would be undistinguishable from a Persian. You would be undistinguishable from a Roman. You would not have that identity of Israel because you never fought angels, Esau's angel. You never fought the red one with the power of the Holy Spirit. So in a nutshell, the prophecies that we've looked at are cautioning Israel against acquiring an identity of Babylon when they're in Babylon. They have to know when to flee to the wilderness in order to retain their identity as Israelites and to retain the faith of Israelites. Because like he's saying, they'll be side by side here. It's going to culminate in some sort of supernatural intervention. And if you're an Israelite walking in your covenant, then you don't have to worry about missing the boat. You don't have to worry about missing the cloud any more than a grain of wheat worries about the harvest. Instead, what your job to do is to prepare for the harvest. Did you see, Yeshua said there's going to be 2 men out in the field. There's going to be 2 women grinding at a mill. They are going to be expectant that the harvest will continue. For the righteous, that ultimate harvest is going to be the resurrection. For the wicked, they will be the harvest. They will be wicked. They will be that stumbling block removed out of the earth. So we have to prepare. We have to have that expectation of ultimate salvation and redemption. We have to separate ourselves from evil, and then we don't have to worry about being the stumbling block removed. And so in the next lesson, we're going to get very specific about the conditions that are prophesied to exist during the footsteps of Messiah. We'll spend a little more time looking at the 4 altar judgments, the plague, the famine, the sword, the wild beast. And then we're also going to take a look at the 4 craftsmen, because it has to do with rebuilding the temple and how the footsteps of Messiah, they're going to be very uncomfortable, but maybe not what you thought. It looks like halfway through this 7-year tribulation that we'll actually see a turnaround for people of righteousness. For others, it says, Thyatira, for the wicked, they will be thrown into great tribulation. For the rotten figs, great tribulation. The unripe figs, great tribulation. But for the righteous, it looks like there's a turning point midway in that 7 years of the final tribulation. And so we want to look at how Elijah, King Messiah, Melchizedek, and the anointed one of war are thought to play roles in those end times. And I think that's it. Yes, it is. Okay. Wasn't sure I could get through that tonight.